first permanent settlements in West Asia, of the Fertile Crescent, the transition from foraging to collecting to cultivating took place over several centuries, but these gradual changes did serve to mark a very distinct era of permanent settlement during the Neolithic period. Increased rainfall around 9600 BC meant that the Jordan River would swell yearly, in the process depositing layers of fertile soil along its banks. This fertile soil allowed locals to rely on agriculture for survival. Soon after, they founded Jericho just north of the Dead Sea. Perhaps the very first time in human history that a completely viable population was living in the same place. At the same time, 17 by Jericho's height, around 9000 BC, the settlement's population reached the hundreds. This increase cannot be considered an urban boom, of course, and the transition away from foraging occurred gradually. For example, excavations from this area have unearthed no separation of tasks or dwellings by gender or skill. However, by the end of Jericho's development, maintaining large populations in one place would prove to produce other extensive adjustments. 18. Jericho's residents did distinguish themselves from their hunter-gatherer predecessors, however, through their relatively extensive construction projects. They used mud bricks to build a wall that encircled the settlement, probably for flood control, a tower, and separate buildings for grain storage. The former foragers now living at Jericho could rely on fish or other aquatic creatures for meat as they experimented with permanent settlement, but those foragers living further away from large bodies of water would need another source of meat. This need increasingly was met by animal domestication. Domestication would prove to be a slow process, as humans learn the hard way that zebras bite, impalas are claustrophobic, and bighorn sheep do not obey orders. In other words, some animals cannot be domesticated, but this is information only understood through trial and error. By about 7500 BC, however, humans in the Taurus and Zagros mountains employed selective breeding to eventually domesticate mountain sheep and goats. The temperament and size of pigs and cows delayed their domestication until the 6000s BC, but this process proved equally, if not more important, than that of sheep and goats. As agriculture and animal domestication progressed, settlements around the Mediterranean became larger and more sophisticated. By 7000 BC, on the Anatolian plateau, Catalhook reached several thousands of inhabitants. The residents at Catalhook buried their dead, constructed uniform adjacent houses with elaborate designs painted on their interior walls, and had multiple workshops where, among other activities, they wove baskets and made obsidian mirrors as well as daggers with carved bone handles. 19 Catalhook denizens wove wool into cloth, developed a varied diet of peas, nuts, vegetable oil, apples, honey, and the usual grains. And improved weapons technology with sharper arrows added to their use of daggers and lances. These gains may seem modest by our standards, but the legacy of communal living and ultimately, political centralization that they introduced was extraordinary. Jericho and Catalhook were surely some of the most notable early settlements, but they were not alone. The appearance of these two settlements was accompanied by the increasing presence of village life across the world. Most early agricultural villages in Southwest Asia and around the world were very similar in appearance. They had around 20 residents and were organized around grain cultivation and storage. Small huts were organized in a loose circle, and grain silos were placed between each hut. Labor was a communal activity, and village members all spent time hoeing the fields or hunting. The most valuable asset to a community was the grain itself, but neither it nor the land where it grew belonged to one individual. This model existed for hundreds and even thousands of years in some areas, until the villages stopped hunting and domesticated animals. For many scholars, the abandonment of hunting represents the real Neolithic revolution. As communities completely abandoned hunting and gathering, they dedicated more energy to warfare, religion, and construction. In consequence, dwellings and settlements grew, along with a concomitant focus on tool and weapon making. leaving Paleolithic culture behind. While the Neolithic era is described in greater detail elsewhere, it is important to understand Paleolithic and Neolithic differences in order to convey a sense of just how revolutionary the shift to agriculture was for humanity. For example, agriculture contributed to, along with religion and trade, the development of class. Before agriculture, hunter-gatherers divided tasks like seed gathering, grinding, or tool-making. However, without large-scale building projects like aqueducts or canals required for agriculture, hierarchies were much less pronounced. The intensification of agriculture during the Neolithic required irrigation, plowing, and terracing, all of which were labor-intensive. The amount of labor required could not be met through simple task division. Someone had to be in charge. This meant the establishment of ruling elites, a societal grouping that had not existed during the Paleolithic. While violence certainly existed during the Paleolithic period, organized warfare was an invention of the Neolithic. Agriculture meant larger populations and settlements that were more tightly packed and closer to one another. These closer quarters created new social and economic pressures that could produce organized violence. Agricultural intensification produced stores of food and valuables that could be seized by neighbors. During the 9000s BC, settlements like Jericho began to build defensive walls, while skeletons unearthed in the area reveal wounds from new types of projectiles, like the Kayam point, developed during the era. 21. Family life also changed significantly during the Neolithic. Sedentary communities invested more time and resources into the construction of permanent homes, housing nuclear families. People spent less time with the community as a whole, and within homes it became easier to accumulate wealth and keep secrets. This shift in gender roles after agriculture seems to be even more pronounced, as the role of women became more important as humans moved out of the Paleolithic and into the Neolithic era. During the Paleolithic era, and until recently in fact, a child would be breastfed until he or she was 3 or 4 years old, a necessity, preventing mothers from joining long-distance hunting expeditions without their toddlers. However, a breastfeeding woman could complete tasks that don't require rapt concentration, are relatively dull and repetitive. They are easily interrupted, don't place the child in danger, and don't require the participant to stray far from home. 22. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were some of these tasks. Also, the essential tasks of preparing food and clothing could be accomplished with a nursing toddler nearby. These tasks that may be consigned as women's work today are among the most important tasks, and very time-consuming ones before the Industrial Revolution, that a human could perform. In fact, they were so time-consuming that women would spend most of their day on them, often being assisted by men. Over time, Paleolithic women gathered new species of berries as well as bird eggs, and learned which mushrooms were non-toxic. Women also were the principal gatherers of mosses for sleeping, mats and other plants for shelter. When men returned with a kill, the women then began an involved process of dressing and butchering it. Sinews from animals and fibers from plants became rope to tie or fasten the hides as well as baskets. Women thus were essential to any kind of productivity or progress associated with hunting. Women used sinews and fibers to create netting for transport, and for hunting and fishing. In hunting societies with elements of horticulture, women were responsible for, and could provide, such food as legumes, eggs, and grains. Food gathering and weaving, especially in the dry Mediterranean, was an outdoor and community activity that also served as a preschool and apprentice system for children. So women were also community educators. Neolithic women. While Paleolithic women certainly had important responsibilities, the added tasks of herding and animal domestication expanded their roles tremendously in the Neolithic era. Neolithic survival required not only effective food storage, but also increased production. Children on a farm can be more helpful and put in less danger than those on a hunt. Neolithic women increasingly bore more children, either because of increased food production or to help augment it. This increase in childbearing may also have offset an increase in mortality due, for example, to disease. Because dangers from disease grew in new villages due to the ease with which deadly diseases spread in close quarters, and nearby domesticated animals whose diseases spread from animal to humans, more children would be necessary to replace those who had succumbed to illness. While Neolithic women carried an increased childbearing responsibility, their other responsibilities did not necessarily wane. Though women may not have fired pottery when it began to appear some 6,000 years ago, they appeared on it in decorative symbols of female fertility. Around 4000 BC, gendered tasks shifted again with the domestication of draft animals. Food production once again became men's domain, as herding was incompatible with childrearing. Later in Neolithic herding societies, women were often responsible for the actual domestication of feral babies, nursing them and raising them. Men would shear sheep, help weave, market the textiles, and cultivate the food that was prepared in the home. We should say that this was not the case with all agricultural societies, as many horticulturalists who were able to cultivate crops closer to home were able to remain matrilineal. For example, we have the case of Minoan women on the Mediterranean island of Crete.